He started the fight in class until she finished it without mercy. Then he learned that picking fights with humans based on size advantage was like challenging a plasma cutter to a duel because it looked small and harmless. Spoiler alert, appearances stop mattering the moment you get dismantled in front of 40 witnesses who are definitely recording everything. Let me tell you about the day I learned that human self-defense training includes psychological warfare components specifically designed to humiliate aggressors in the most efficient way possible. My name is Professor Kelvin Thrace, Senior Combat Instructor at the Galactic Military Academy on Station Pinnacle 9, and I have taught tactical combat for 22 standard cycles. I have trained officers from 67 different species, supervised over 10,000 sparring sessions, and intervened in approximately 300 altercations that escalated beyond acceptable training parameters. Point is, I know fighting. I understand combat dynamics, what separates controlled training from actual violence, what signs indicate a situation is about to deteriorate from educational exercise to disciplinary incident. I can read aggressive body language across multiple species, predict when someone is about to do something stupid, and intervene before students injure themselves or others. I thought I had seen every possible variation of classroom violence, from clumsy inexperience to malicious intent, from accidents to calculated attacks. Then I watched Cadet Riley Santos dismantle Cadet Vrock with such systematic precision that I couldn't decide whether to file a disciplinary report or request that she teach a masterclass on controlled aggression. The incident happened during advanced hand-to-hand combat, a course designed for senior students who had already completed basic training and were preparing for field command positions. The curriculum focused on practical combat applicable to situations where weapons were unavailable, emphasizing technique over raw strength and adaptability over rigid forms. My teaching philosophy was simple: understanding violence was essential for officers who might face it in the field, and controlled training was the safest way to develop that understanding. Students learn to fight effectively while maintaining discipline and respect for training partners. Most students. Cadet Vrock was a Krellian, roughly 220 centimeters tall, approximately 140 kilograms of muscle and natural armor plating, with forearms that provided significant advantage in grappling situations. He was also arrogant, dismissive of training partners he perceived as weaker, and increasingly problematic in his attitude toward species he considered inferior. I had reprimanded him twice for excessive force during sparring and once for making derogatory comments about human physical capabilities. Humans are too small for real combat, Vrock had said during a previous session, loud enough for the entire class to hear. They rely on technology because their bodies are inadequate. Put them in hand-to-hand against a real warrior species and they fold immediately. Cadet Vrock, your assessment is based on incomplete information, I had responded. Human combat capabilities are not determined solely by size and strength. They have other attributes that make them formidable opponents, like what? Their fragile bones. Their single heart that stops their entire system if damaged. Their thin skin that tears from minor trauma. Vrock had laughed, and several other Krellian students had joined in. These are not advantages, Professor. These are design flaws. I had made a note to pair Vrock with a human student for his next sparring session, thinking that practical demonstration might correct his misconceptions more effectively than theoretical instruction. That note became prophetic 3 days later when I assigned sparring pairs for advanced technique practice. Cadet Vrock, you'll partner with Cadet Santos, I announced, reading from my rotation list. Focus on grappling escapes and reversal techniques. Cadet Riley Santos was human, approximately 165 centimeters tall, maybe 60 kilograms, with the athletic build that came from regular training rather than genetic advantage. She had dark hair pulled back in practical style, brown skin, and these brown eyes that tracked everything happening in the training space with focused attention. She was a solid student, good technique, excellent tactical awareness, never caused problems. Not remarkable by obvious metrics, but consistently competent in ways that mattered. Vrock looked at her and made a sound that his species used to indicate contempt. Professor, is this a joke? She's half my size. This isn't training, this is a waste of time. Size differential training is valuable, I said. Real combat doesn't give you ideal opponents. You need to practice against various body types and capabilities. I need to practice against opponents who provide actual challenge, Vrock corrected. Not fragile humans who will break if I apply real technique. I won't break, Santos said quietly. It was the first time she had spoken during the exchange, and something about her tone made my instructor instincts activate warning protocols. Not aggressive exactly, more like certain. absolutely certain in a way that suggested she knew something Vrock didn't. "You will break," Vrock said, moving toward her with body language that was more threatening than appropriate for training. "Your species always breaks. Soft bones, weak joints, inadequate muscle density. Your prey species pretending to be predators. I'll demonstrate gently so you don't require medical attention, but you should understand your limitations." "I understand my limitations," Santos said, taking position on the training mat. "Do you understand yours?" That should have been my signal to intervene, to separate them and reassign partners before Vrock's arrogance and Santos's subtle challenge created a dangerous situation. But I was curious, honestly. Vrock needed his assumptions corrected, and sometimes the best correction came from direct experience rather than instructor lectures. "Standard sparring rules," I announced to the class. "Controlled contact, tap out when you're caught, no strikes to critical areas, fight ends when I call stop or when someone submits. This is training, not combat. Maintain discipline." The students formed a circle around the mat, the standard observation formation for sparring sessions. I saw several human students watching Santos with expressions that suggested they knew something the rest of the class didn't. "Interesting. Begin," I called. Vrock moved immediately, using his size and reach advantage to attempt a grappling lock that should have been trivially easy against a smaller opponent. He had 4 arms to her 2, significant strength advantage, and approximately 80 kilograms more mass. The technique was sound, the execution was competent, and it should have resulted in quick dominance. Santos wasn't there. She had moved, not just dodged but repositioned entirely, and suddenly she was beside Vrock rather than in front of him, one of her hands on his lower right arm in a grip that looked almost casual. "Your stance is unbalanced," Santos said, her voice carrying that same quiet certainty. "Overcommitting with your upper arms leaves your lower body exposed." Vrock tried to grab her with his upper arms, but she was already moving again, flowing around his attempt like water around stone, and now she had a lock on his lower left arm, her body positioned where his forearmed advantage became a liability because he couldn't effectively bring force to bear from that angle. "You're relying too much on strength," Santos continued, still in that instructional tone. "Against opponents your own size, that works. Against smaller opponents with better technique, you're giving away control points." Vrock roared, clearly frustrated, and tried to use his mass advantage to simply crush Santos by falling on her. It was a valid technique against smaller opponents, using weight to overcome technical skill. Santos stepped aside, used his momentum against him, and Vrock crashed to the mat hard enough to make the impact-absorbing surface compress visibly. "Predictable," Santos observed. "You telegraph your attacks because you're used to opponents who can't avoid them. You need to work on that." I should have stopped the match. The dynamic was clearly unbalanced, not in Vrock's favor as expected, but in Santos's favor in ways that were becoming increasingly obvious. But the educational value was significant. Watching Santos systematically deconstruct Vrock's assumptions in real time was worth the blow to his ego. Vrock got up, his armor plating flushed darker in what I recognized as Krellian anger response. "You're fast," he admitted. "But speed doesn't matter when I connect. One solid hit and you're done. Then you should probably try to connect," Santos said, and there was just a hint of smile at the edge of her expression. That smile was apparently the final insult Vrock could tolerate. He abandoned all pretense of training technique and simply charged, all 4 arms extended to grab, relying on size and aggression to overwhelm Santos through pure physical dominance. This was no longer sparring. This was assault, violation of every training protocol we had, dangerous and unacceptable behavior that required immediate intervention. I started to call stop. Too slow. Santos didn't retreat from Vrock's charge. She moved into it, which was the last thing anyone expected, closing distance instead of creating it, and suddenly she was inside his guard where his reach advantage became useless. What happened next took maybe 3 seconds total, but I'm going to describe it in detail because those 3 seconds redefined my understanding of human combat capability and exactly how much damage could be inflicted without technically breaking any rules about excessive force. Santos grabbed Vrock's lower right arm with both hands, dropped her weight, and used a technique that I recognized from human martial arts, specifically judo, a throwing method that redirected an opponent's momentum against them. Vrock's charge became a flight, his own mass and velocity converted into rotational force that sent him airborne. He hit the mat flat on his back with impact that drove air from his lungs in an audible gasp. Before he could recover, Santos had transitioned to mount position, which put her on top of his torso with her knees controlling his upper arms while her hands controlled his lower arms. Perfect positional dominance that negated all of his physical advantages. This is called the mount, Santos explained, her breathing elevated but controlled. It's a dominant position in ground fighting. You're flat on your back, I'm on top, your arms are controlled. You can't generate effective force from here. You can't escape without technique I haven't seen you demonstrate. You're completely neutralized. Vrock tried to buck her off using his greater mass, a reasonable escape attempt. Santos rode the movement easily, maintaining her position through balance and weight distribution rather than strength. That doesn't work against trained grapplers, she said. You're burning energy while I stay comfortable. The longer this continues, the more exhausted you get while I remain relatively fresh. This is efficiency versus strength, and efficiency wins longer engagements. Get off me, Vrock growled, still struggling. This isn't real combat. If I had my weapons, if you had weapons, you wouldn't have tried to grapple me, Santos interrupted. You initiated this close-range encounter because you thought size advantage guaranteed victory. You were wrong. Now you're controlled and helpless, and you're making excuses instead of learning. That's disappointing. Vrock made a sound of pure rage and tried one more escape, attempting to bridge his hips and roll to displace Santos. She countered smoothly, transitioning to an arm lock that hyperextended his lower right elbow to just before the breaking point. That's a submission hold, Santos said. If I extend your arm another 2 centimeters, your joint dislocates. In competition, you'd tap out now to signal submission. In actual combat, I'd break your arm and move to the next target. Your choice. Which scenario this is, Cadet Santos? Release and return to standing position, I said, finally recovering my instructor authority. Cadet Vrock, you are done for today. Report to my office after class. Santos released Vrock immediately and stood, offering her hand to help him up in the traditional gesture of respect between training partners. Vrock ignored the hand, rolling to his feet with movements that suggested injured pride more than physical damage. You got lucky, Vrock said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent training space. I wasn't taking you seriously. Real fight, different outcome. No, Santos said, and the absolute certainty in her voice made every student stop and pay attention. Real fight, I win faster. Training rules protected you, not me. You tried to use size and strength to overwhelm someone you perceived as weak. That's the thinking that gets real warriors killed by opponents they underestimate. She gestured at the training space. You outweigh me by 80 kilograms, you have 4 arms, you have natural armor, you have every physical advantage. And I controlled you completely within seconds because I have technique you don't, training you lack, and experience fighting people bigger and stronger than me since I was 6 years old. Your advantages are real. My skills are better. That's not luck. That's preparation meeting opportunity. This is humiliating, Vrock said. Being defeated by a human, being defeated by anyone who trained harder than you should be humiliating. Santos cut him off. The fact that you're more embarrassed about losing to a human than about losing because you were unprepared says everything about your priorities. You care more about species pride than actual competence. She moved closer to him, no threat in her posture but absolute confidence in her bearing. You started this. You said humans were too weak for real combat. You dismissed me as a waste of your training time. You tried to demonstrate human inferiority by using your physical advantages to dominate someone you thought couldn't defend themselves. You turned a training exercise into an ego demonstration. Santos paused, making sure everyone in the class was listening. I finished it by showing you that physical advantages don't matter when skill differential is this significant. I could have hurt you, Vrock. Multiple times. Joint locks that cause permanent damage. Strikes to vulnerable areas. Chokes that render you unconscious in seconds. I didn't do any of those things because this is training, and you're supposed to be my partner, not my enemy. But make no mistake, I controlled that entire encounter. You were never in danger of winning once I decided you needed a lesson. You dare, Vrock started. I dare, Santos said flatly. Because you made this about species superiority instead of individual skill. You wanted to prove humans were inferior. I proved you were wrong. If that damages your ego, that's your problem, not mine. Maybe use the experience to become a better fighter instead of a bitter loser. The training space was absolutely silent. Every student was watching this confrontation between a 140-kilogram Krellian and a 60-kilogram human, and the size difference suddenly seemed irrelevant compared to the difference in presence and certainty. "Cadet Santos, that's enough," I said. "Return to your position." "Cadet Vrak, my office, now. The rest of you, pair up and continue drilling." This class is about learning, not entertainment. The students scattered to their assigned partners, but the energy in the room had changed. I saw human students with expressions of satisfaction, saw non-human students reassessing their assumptions, saw everyone processing what they had just witnessed. I escorted Vrak to my office and delivered a formal reprimand for escalating training into aggression, for failing to maintain proper control, for letting ego override discipline. He accepted the reprimand with barely concealed resentment, clearly more angry about being defeated than about his breach of protocol. After dismissing Vrak, I called Santos to my office. She entered with proper military bearing, standing at attention, waiting for whatever consequence was coming. "Cadet Santos, your handling of that situation was technically flawless from a combat perspective," I said. "Your technique was excellent, your control was precise, and you neutralized a significant size and strength disadvantage through superior skill. However, your verbal engagement with Cadet Vrak after the match bordered on unprofessional." "Yes, sir," Santos said. "I apologize for that." "Don't apologize," I said, surprising her. "Explain. Why did you feel the need to verbally confront him after you had already physically demonstrated his errors?" "Because he needed to understand why he lost, sir," Santos said. "Physical defeat without comprehension just builds resentment. He needed to understand that he lost because of his assumptions and lack of preparation, not because of luck or unfair circumstances. If I let him think his loss was a fluke, he'd learn nothing, so the verbal confrontation was educational. It was necessary, sir. Vrak has been dismissing human capability since the beginning of this course. He treats smaller species as automatically inferior. That attitude is dangerous for someone who will command mixed species units. He needed a lesson in humility and respect, delivered in a way he couldn't ignore or rationalize away, by humiliating him in front of his peers, by defeating him in front of witnesses who could confirm what happened," Santos corrected. "He chose to make this about species superiority. I chose to prove him wrong publicly so everyone who heard his claims would also hear the refutation. That's not humiliation, that's correction with appropriate context." I studied her for a long moment. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "Earth, sir. I started martial arts training when I was 6, judo and Brazilian jiu-jitsu initially, added Muay Thai and boxing when I was older. By the time I was 18, I had been training for 12 years and competing nationally. I'm not exceptional by Earth standards, sir. I'm just someone who took training seriously." "You said you have experience fighting people bigger and stronger than you. That's an unusual specialization." "It's not a specialization on Earth, sir. It's necessity. Humans have size and strength variations within our own species, and martial arts training specifically addresses how smaller practitioners defend against larger opponents. We've been developing these techniques for thousands of years because we couldn't rely on everyone being the same size or strength." Santos paused. "Plus, Earth has multiple species of large predators, and human survival has always involved fighting things bigger than us. We're not the biggest or strongest, so we learn to be smarter and more technical. That's our evolutionary advantage: problem solving and tool use. Martial arts are tools for making size irrelevant, yet you used those tools to humiliate Cadet Vrak." "I used those tools to defeat Cadet Vrak," Santos said. "The humiliation was his choice, sir. He could have acknowledged his loss, learned from the experience, and moved forward. Instead, he made excuses and blamed species difference for what was actually a skill difference. That's why I confronted him verbally. He needed to understand that his humiliation came from his attitude, not from his defeat." "That's a fine distinction." "It's an important distinction, sir. Losing fights is part of learning to fight. Every martial artist loses constantly during training. That's how we improve. But making excuses for losses, blaming external factors instead of examining your own performance, that prevents learning." I wanted to make sure Vrak understood he lost for correctable reasons, not for immutable characteristics. "I considered this. You put significant thought into the psychological aspects of that encounter." "Combat is psychological as much as physical, sir. My instructors on Earth taught me that defeating someone's confidence is often more effective than defeating their body. Vrak needed both, Physical defeat to prove I could control him, and psychological defeat to prevent him from dismissing the experience as aberration or luck. That's remarkably calculated for what looked like an emotional confrontation. It wasn't emotional, sir. I wasn't angry at Vrock. I was teaching him. The same way you teach us tactics and strategy, I was teaching him respect and reality. He thought humans were weak, I demonstrated we're not. He thought size guaranteed victory, I proved it doesn't. He thought he could bully smaller opponents without consequence, I showed him the consequences. Educational outcomes, all of them, through what some would call brutal humiliation, through clear demonstration that his assumptions were wrong. Santos corrected again. Sir, would you prefer I had avoided the confrontation entirely? Let him continue believing humans were inferior. Let him potentially endanger future teammates by underestimating human capabilities in the field. No, I admitted. But there are more diplomatic ways to correct misconceptions, are there, sir? Because I've heard you correct Vrock twice about human capabilities. He ignored you both times. Clearly verbal instruction wasn't effective. He needed practical demonstration, which I provided. Sometimes the best teaching method is letting students discover they're wrong through direct experience. She had a point. An uncomfortable point that suggested my own teaching methods had been insufficient for students like Vrock who filtered information through prejudice and ego. How do you feel about what happened? I asked. Satisfied, sir. I accomplished my objectives. Defended myself successfully, corrected dangerous misconceptions, demonstrated human capability to a class that needed to see it. Vrock will be a better officer for this experience, even if he doesn't realize it yet. You sound very certain of that. I am, sir. Because he now knows that size and strength aren't automatic victory conditions. That lesson will make him more cautious, more thoughtful, more likely to respect opponents he might otherwise dismiss. That makes him more likely to survive actual combat and less likely to endanger his troops through overconfidence. Santos met my eyes directly. I didn't enjoy beating him, sir. I don't take pleasure in defeating training partners. But I'm not sorry it happened. He needed the lesson, and I was in position to provide it. Sometimes teaching is uncomfortable for everyone involved. I dismissed Santos with no disciplinary action beyond a minor note about maintaining professional detachment during confrontations. She had been right about too much for me to justify significant consequences. Over the following weeks, I watched the dynamics in my class change substantially. Vrock was quieter, more careful, noticeably more respectful toward human students and other species he had previously dismissed. He never partnered with Santos again by choice, but when random rotation forced them together, he treated the sessions as serious training rather than ego demonstrations. Other students, particularly those from larger species who had shared Vrock's assumptions, became more cautious and thoughtful in their approach to training. The casual dismissal of human capability largely disappeared, replaced by wary respect and genuine curiosity about human martial arts techniques. Santos became an unofficial resource for students wanting to understand ground fighting and techniques for smaller practitioners against larger opponents. She ran optional training sessions on leverage, positioning, and psychological factors in combat, attended by students from multiple species who recognized the value of her knowledge. You created an interesting situation, my colleague Professor Yalath observed during a faculty meeting. One student's humiliation became a teaching moment for your entire class. Santos created the situation, I corrected. I merely failed to prevent it and then observed the educational outcomes. Do you think she planned it? The entire confrontation? Yes, I said. Absolutely. She knew Vrock was arrogant and dismissive. She knew he would escalate training into aggression. She prepared for that inevitability and used it to deliver a lesson to the entire class about assumptions and capability. That's remarkably sophisticated for a student her age. Should we be concerned about students who are that calculating? Should we be grateful for students who use their intelligence to improve overall training outcomes while defending themselves from aggression? I countered. Santos didn't initiate the confrontation. She finished it in a way that produced educational value for everyone present. That's ideal student behavior from my perspective. 3 months later, during final practical examinations, I paired Vrock and Santos again for advanced scenario testing. I watched carefully for signs of residual hostility or grudge behavior. Instead, I saw something unexpected. They worked together efficiently, Vrock using his strength and reach while Santos provided tactical guidance and technical support. When the scenario required close-quarters combat against multiple opponents, they coordinated smoothly, covering each other's weaknesses and capitalizing on complementary strengths. "We've been training together outside class," Santos explained during the after-action review. "Vrock asked me to teach him grappling defense against smaller opponents. I asked him to teach me techniques for dealing with multiple attackers. Mutually beneficial exchange, so you're friends now?" I asked. "We're colleagues who respect each other's capabilities," Santos said. "Friendship might be overstating it. But we recognize that we both have skills the other lacks, and training together makes us both better fighters." "That's enough." Vrock, standing beside her, nodded agreement. "Cadet Santos defeated me completely during our first encounter. That was humbling. Also educational. I learned that physical advantages can be overcome by superior technique, and that underestimating opponents based on appearance is dangerous. She was correct about my deficiencies, and I have worked to correct them by training with the person who humiliated you. By training with the person who demonstrated what I needed to learn," Vrock corrected. "Pride is worthless if it prevents improvement. Santos has knowledge I lack. Learning from her makes me more capable. That's more important than ego." I watched them leave together, discussing techniques and strategy, and I realized that Santos had accomplished something remarkable. She hadn't just defeated Vrock, she had transformed him from an arrogant bully into a thoughtful warrior who valued skill over size. That was teaching at a level that exceeded my own capabilities. He started the fight in class until she finished it without mercy. Then everyone learned that human combat training included psychological components designed not just to win fights but to permanently alter opponents' worldviews through systematic demonstration of their incorrectness. That's not just fighting, that's warfare conducted through education, where victory means changing hearts and minds along with demonstrating physical superiority. My name is Professor Kelvin Thrace, and I used to think teaching combat meant instructing students in techniques and tactics. Now I understand that combat teaching includes managing student egos, correcting dangerous assumptions, and sometimes allowing confrontations to proceed because the educational value exceeds the risks involved. Cadet Santos taught me that lesson by finishing a fight she didn't start with such systematic precision that the outcome became impossible to dismiss or rationalize. She didn't just defeat Vrock, she defeated the assumptions that made him dangerous, and she did it in front of an audience who needed to see that demonstration. That's not cruelty, that's compassionate correction delivered through the only language that Vrock was willing to understand. Physical defeat followed by verbal explanation of why defeat occurred and how to prevent it in future. He started the fight through arrogance and prejudice. She finished it through technique and teaching. And somehow both of them ended up better for the experience, which is the ideal outcome for any training scenario, even ones that begin with someone making catastrophically bad decisions about who to fight and why.